The Galactic Academy of Advanced Studies prided itself on being the most prestigious educational institution in the known universe. Its massive crystal spires reached toward the purple sky of planet New Eden, housing students from over 500 different species. Among them was Jack Stone, the only human in his class. At 42 years old, Jack was considerably older than most first-year students. His weathered face and the slight limp in his walk told stories that his classmates couldn't begin to understand. While other species typically started their higher education at equivalent ages of 18 to 25, Jack had spent the last 2 decades doing something very different. The Academy's anti-discrimination policies meant they had to accept qualified applicants regardless of species or background. Still, that didn't stop the whispers and stares that followed Jack through the holographic halls. Humans were considered a young species, barely a century into space travel, and many viewed them as primitive newcomers to the galactic community. A group of third-year students particularly enjoyed making Jack's life difficult. Led by Blue, a tall Centaurian with iridescent scales and 4 arms, they would deliberately bump into him in the corridors or knock his data tablets off his desk during shared lectures. Blue's gang included Spike, a spiny Rigelian, and Gleam, a crystalline being from the Silicon Worlds. "Look who it is," Blue's melodic voice rang out one afternoon as Jack made his way to advanced xenobiology. "The primitive trying to play scholar. Shouldn't you be on your backwater planet throwing spears at each other?" Jack kept walking, his face impassive. 20 years in the corporate wars had taught him patience. He'd faced down plasma cannons and orbital strikes, a few bullies weren't worth his attention. "Hey, I'm talking to you, ape." Blue reached out with one of his lower arms to grab Jack's shoulder. It was a mistake. Years of combat instinct kicked in before Jack could stop himself. His hand moved in a blur, catching Blue's wrist in a grip that made the alien scales pale from azure to light gray. Jack immediately released him, but the damage was done. "How dare you touch me?" Blue hissed, rubbing his wrist while Spike and Gleam moved to flank him. "You'll regret this, human. The Academy Board will hear about this assault." Jack finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of countless battlefields. "Camera drones record everything in these halls. They'll see you initiated contact. I suggest we all continue to class." Blue's inner eyelids flickered in surprise. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected from the supposedly primitive human. There was something in Jack's stance, the way he held himself, that made the alien's instincts scream danger. "This isn't over," Blue muttered, but he and his friends quickly moved past Jack and disappeared around a corner. That evening in his dormitory pod, Jack sat on his regulation bed, looking out at the alien sunset. He'd come to the Academy to start a new life, to leave behind the memories of burning cities and orbital bombardments. He'd served as a corporate mercenary in the wars between Earth's megacorporations, fighting in conflicts that reshaped continents. Now he wanted to heal instead of harm, studying xenobiology to help bridge the gap between species. But as he polished his worn combat boots out of habit, old habits died hard. Jack knew that Blue and his friends wouldn't let this go. They'd push until something broke. He just hoped it wouldn't come to that. He'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. Little did his alien classmates know that the primitive human they enjoyed tormenting had once led elite mercenary units in battles that would make their scales fall off in terror. Jack had chosen peace, but he hadn't forgotten war. And if Blue pushed too far, he might learn why humans, despite their primitive status, had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. A week after the hallway incident, Jack noticed a change in the Academy's atmosphere. Where before he'd faced open mockery, now other students watched him with nervous curiosity. Blue's wrist had developed a distinct bruise pattern that his transparent scales couldn't hide, and rumors spread quickly in the Academy's crowded halls. During advanced xenobiology, Professor Green, a tall plantoid being with leafy appendages, assigned a crucial group project. This assignment will count for 30% of your final grade, she announced, her leaves rustling with excitement. Groups will study the cellular adaptation mechanisms of 3 different species. Jack's heart sank as Professor Green began assigning teams. His worst fears were confirmed when she announced, Team 5, Blue, Spike, Gleam, and Jack Stone. Blue's scales flickered with malicious delight. Jack knew this wasn't a coincidence, the Centaurian must have requested this arrangement through his influential family connections. After class, Blue approached Jack with false friendliness. "Partner, we're meeting in Lab 7 tonight at midnight. Don't be late." His tone made it clear this wasn't just about the project. Jack considered reporting the obvious trap but dismissed the idea. In his experience, authority rarely helped in these situations. Besides, he'd rather deal with this directly than let it fester. At 23:55, Jack walked into Lab 7. The large room was filled with advanced biological scanning equipment and specimen containers. Blue, Spike, and Gleam were already there, along with 2 new faces, massive reptiloids from the warrior caste of the Draconis system. "Look who decided to show up," Blue sneered. "You know, after you assaulted me, I did some research on humans. Fascinating how fragile your bones are compared to Centaurian physiology." Jack remained near the door, his eyes scanning the room. Out of habit. 6 hostiles. Multiple obstacles. 3 emergency exits. The same tactical assessment he'd done thousands of times before. "This isn't necessary," Jack said calmly. "We can just do the project and move on." Gleam's crystalline body chimed with laughter. "The primitive wants to study. Maybe we should teach you about advanced alien biology firsthand." The 2 Draconis students moved to block the main exit. Jack noticed they were wearing personal shield generators, illegal for students but common among wealthy families. "You really brought shield generators to a school fight?" Jack couldn't help but chuckle, which seemed to enrage Blue even more. "We're not stupid, human," Blue hissed. "We saw how you moved last week. But let's see how your combat reflexes handle energy shields." Jack's mind raced through his options. He'd fought shield users before during the corporate wars. The generators were powerful but had 2 major weaknesses: they couldn't block slow-moving objects, and they drained quickly under sustained pressure. "Last chance," Jack warned, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from real combat experience. "Walk away, and we forget this happened." Blue gave a hand signal, and everyone moved at once. Spike launched a barrage of neural stinger quills, a natural weapon that would paralyze most beings. Jack dropped and rolled, the quills embedding themselves in a specimen container behind him. The 2 Draconis guards charged, their shields humming with energy. Jack grabbed a nearby lab stool and threw it underhand. The slow-moving object passed right through the shield, catching the first Draconis in the knee. As the guard stumbled, Jack was already moving, using the larger alien's momentum against him. Years of muscle memory took over. Jack didn't fight like a brawler, he fought like someone trained to end conflicts quickly and efficiently. He struck precise points, used leverage instead of strength, and stayed constantly in motion. The second Draconis swung a massive fist, shield blazing. Jack stepped inside the swing, past the shield's boundary. A quick strike to a nerve cluster, and the guard's leg gave out. Their shield generators, expensive as they were, became useless in close combat. Spike tried to circle around, but Jack kicked a rolling table toward him, scattering lab equipment. The Rigelian jumped back, afraid of damaging the expensive instruments. Through all this, Blue and Gleam stood watching, their confidence crumbling as they witnessed what a primitive human could do. This wasn't the clumsy brawling they'd expected, this was professional violence, executed with terrifying precision. "Stop!" Blue shouted as Jack disabled the second Draconis guard with a joint lock. This isn't possible." You're just a human. Jack stood up slowly, his breathing barely elevated. I was a tactical commander for the Eclipse Mercenary Corps during the corporate wars. 16 years of active combat across 3 solar systems. I've fought things a lot scarier than a few bullies with stolen shield generators. The room fell silent except for the groaning of the Draconis guards. Even Gleam's crystalline body had stopped its usual subtle chiming. Now, Jack continued, straightening his uniform, should we start working on that xenobiology project? I have some fascinating first-hand observations about Draconis pressure points we could include. Blue's scales had turned almost white with fear. The Centaurian had heard of the corporate wars, everyone had. They were spoken of in whispers, a dark chapter of human history where private armies fought with planet-killing weapons. And he'd been trying to bully a veteran of those wars. We should report you, Gleam chimed nervously. For what? Jack asked. Defending myself against armed attackers? Those shield generators are highly illegal for students. But I'm willing to forget this happened if you are. The aliens looked at each other, then at their groaning Draconis friends who were slowly getting up. They realized they had severely underestimated what they were dealing with. The project, Blue said quickly. Yes. We should focus on the project. Maybe we could meet in the library next time? During normal hours? Jack nodded, hiding a small smile. Sometimes the best way to achieve peace was to demonstrate exactly why it was preferable to the alternative. News of the Lab 7 incident spread through the academy like a quantum wave, despite everyone involved staying quiet about it. The 2 Draconis guards disappeared from campus, likely recalled by their embarrassed families. Blue and his friends now sat at the front of every class, as far from Jack as possible. But Jack's victory had unexpected consequences. One morning, he found a message waiting on his data tablet, Board of Ethics meeting, attendance required. Walking into the meeting room, Jack found himself facing 5 of the most influential beings in the academy. At the center sat Director Thunder, an energy being contained within an ornate environmental suit. On either side were representatives from the major galactic species, a Centaurian elder, no doubt related to Blue, a Silicon World administrator, a Rigelian high caste member, and a wizened plantoid professor. Mr. Stone, Director Thunder's voice crackled with artificial translation. We've received some concerning reports about your background. You failed to disclose your full military history in your application. Jack sat straight in his chair, keeping his face neutral. With respect, Director, I disclosed my service as required. The application asked for the last 5 years of employment. I provided that information. The Centaurian elder's scales rippled with disapproval. You were part of the Eclipse Mercenary Corps. They were involved in the devastation of 3 colony worlds during the corporate wars. I was, Jack admitted. Which is exactly why I'm here now. I've seen enough destruction. I want to learn how to heal, how to bring species together instead of tearing them apart. The Silicon World Administrator chimed in, their crystalline form refracting light across the room. Noble words, but your recent actions suggest otherwise. You disabled 2 students with military-grade combat techniques. 2 armed students wearing illegal shield generators, who ambushed me along with 4 others, Jack corrected. I used minimal force to defend myself. Director Thunder's energy form swirled in contemplation. I have a proposal, the plantoid professor said. Mr. Stone clearly has valuable, if controversial, experience. Perhaps he could teach as well as learn. All eyes turned to the professor. We've been discussing adding a practical xenobiology defense course, they continued. Understanding how different species bodies work in conflict situations could help prevent future violence. Mr. Stone could assist in teaching this, under supervision. The Silicon World Administrator vibrated skeptically. Turn our potential liability into an asset? Exactly, the professor's leaves quivered with enthusiasm. Who better to teach about preventing interspecies conflict than someone who has seen its worst effects? Director Thunder's energy patterns shifted through various colors before settling. Mr. Stone, would you be willing to take on such a role, in addition to your studies? Jack considered the offer carefully. Teaching others about what he'd learned the hard way might help prevent future conflicts. Plus, it would give him a chance to show that humans could be more than just soldiers. I would be honored, he said. But I have one condition: the course should include conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques, not just combat applications. The plantoid professor's leaves rustled with approval. Excellent suggestion. We could include comparative cultural studies to help students understand why conflicts arise between species. Director Thunder turned to the other board members. Shall we put it to a vote? The Centaurian elder looked like they wanted to object, but the others were already signaling agreement. Even the Silicon World Administrator's crystalline form had taken on a more positive resonance. Very well, Director Thunder announced. Mr. Stone, you will continue your studies and assist in developing this new course. However, we will be monitoring your behavior closely. Any further incidents, regardless of provocation, will result in immediate expulsion. As Jack left the meeting, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He hadn't come to the academy expecting to teach, but maybe this was exactly what he needed, a chance to use his dark experiences to bring some light into the galaxy. Walking back to his dormitory, he noticed the other students' reactions had changed again. Where there had been fear after the Lab 7 incident, now there was curiosity. A young Rigelian student even gave him a respectful nod as he passed. In his room, Jack found a message from Blue. I heard about the new course. My family has influence. I may have helped convince them to give you a chance. Consider it repayment for not reporting the shield generators. Jack smiled. Maybe there was hope for interspecies understanding after all, even if it sometimes took a few bruises to get there. The Academy's massive lecture hall was packed for the first session of Practical Xenobiology and Conflict Resolution. Students from every major species filled the tiered seats, their curiosity palpable. In the front row, Jack spotted Blue and his friends, their presence a reminder of how much had changed in the past month. Welcome, the plantoid professor's leaves rustled as they addressed the class. I'm Professor Green, and with me is Jack Stone, our special instructor for this course. Today, we'll discuss why understanding alien biology isn't just about medicine, it's about survival. Jack stepped forward, fighting back memories of briefing mercenary teams before battle. This was different. This was about preventing violence, not causing it. Let's start with a scenario, Jack began. You're in a dark alley. A Rigelian is threatening you. Their spines are raised, suggesting they're ready to launch neural stinger quills. What do you do? A crystalline student chimed in. Fight back. Rigelian quills can't penetrate silicon-based life forms. And that attitude, Jack pointed out, is exactly how interspecies conflicts escalate. What if I told you that raised spines among Rigelians can also be a sign of fear? That in their culture, it's a defensive reaction, not just an aggressive one. Spike, sitting next to Blue, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His own spines lifted slightly before he consciously relaxed them. In the corporate wars, Jack continued, I saw countless conflicts that could have been avoided with better understanding. Take the Centaurian diplomatic incident on New Mars. A human colony leader thought a Centaurian delegate was showing aggression when their scales turned red. What they didn't know was that for Centaurians, red scales can also indicate respectful attention. Blue's scales flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected his species to be used as a positive example. As the lecture continued, Jack moved through different scenarios, each highlighting how misunderstandings of alien biology and culture could lead to violence. He demonstrated defensive techniques that wouldn't harm different species, and more importantly, showed how to recognize signs of fear versus aggression across various alien physiologies. After class, a group of students lingered, including Blue and his former gang. The Centaurian raised his hand hesitantly. "Mr. Stone," Blue's scales shifted to a formal pattern, "you mentioned the New Mars incident. My grandfather was that delegate. He always said humans were too quick to assume violence, but you're different." "I had to be," Jack replied. "When you fight alongside and against different species for 20 years, you learn to look past your assumptions. Or you die." The words hung heavy in the air until Gleam chimed in. "Could you tell us more about the corporate wars? Our historical records are incomplete." Jack considered the request carefully. "Meet me in study room 12 after dinner. But understand, some of these stories aren't easy to hear." That evening, Jack found not just Blue's group waiting, but nearly 20 students from various species. They sat in a circle, their different biologies creating a living rainbow of colors, textures, and forms. "Before I start," Jack said, "I need you to understand something. The corporate wars weren't glorious. They were what happens when profit matters more than life, any form of life." He told them about the Battle of Titan's Mines, where human and alien mercenaries fought side by side against corporate security forces. About watching a Rigelian save a human child during the evacuation of New Singapore, taking 3 plasma bolts in the process. About a Centaurian medic who treated both sides in the Martian siege, their scales permanently scarred from radiation exposure. "We weren't heroes," Jack explained, his voice heavy with memory. "We were beings trying to survive in a war that never should have happened. That's why this academy, why understanding each other, matters so much." As he spoke, Jack noticed something remarkable. The students weren't sitting segregated by species anymore. A young Rigelian was explaining their spine language to a fascinated Silicon World student. Blue was discussing Centaurian color patterns with a plantoid classmate. "Mr. Stone," a voice called from the doorway. It was Director Thunder, their energy form glowing softly. "May I join you?" The room fell silent as the director entered. Their environmental suit hummed quietly as they moved to the center of the circle. "I've been monitoring your classes," Thunder's translated voice filled the room. "I must admit, I had doubts about this program. But seeing this..." They gestured to the mixed group of students. "This is what the academy was meant to be." Blue stood up, his scales showing a formal pattern. "Director, we've been thinking. The current xenobiology curriculum doesn't include enough practical information about different species. Maybe Mr. Stone's course should be mandatory?" Several students nodded in agreement. Even those who had once feared or mocked Jack were now supporting the idea. Director Thunder's energy form pulsed thoughtfully. "An interesting proposal. Mr. Stone, would you be willing to expand your teaching role?" Jack looked around the room at the eager faces that belonged to beings who, just weeks ago, would never have sat together voluntarily. "On one condition," he said. "We make it a collaborative effort. Every student shares their species' perspective. We learn from each other, not just from me." "Agreed," Thunder's form brightened. "We'll call it, Advanced Interspecies Relations and Understanding." As the students left that evening, Jack noticed Blue lingering behind. The Centaurian scales showed a pattern Jack had never seen before. "That pattern," Blue said, noticing Jack's attention, "it's called renewal in our language. It's what we show when something old becomes something new." He paused. "I was wrong about you, about humans. We all were." Jack smiled. "We were all wrong about each other. That's why we're here, to make it right." 6 months had passed since Jack's first confrontation in the academy halls. The end-of-term evaluations were approaching, and the campus buzzed with nervous energy from students of all species. But something else was causing excitement: the first interspecies exhibition day, an event that had grown from Jack's teaching program. The Academy's Grand Hall had been transformed. Different species demonstrated their unique abilities and cultural practices, not as threats or curiosities, but as ways to build understanding. Jack watched from the sidelines as Blue, now one of his most dedicated students, explained Centaurian scale patterns to a group of fascinated first-years. "Hard to believe this all started with a fight," Professor Green said, coming to stand beside Jack. Their leaves rustled with amusement. "You've changed this place, you know." Before Jack could respond, an urgent message flashed across all communication screens: "Emergency alert, incoming corporate warship detected. All students proceed to designated shelter areas." Jack's combat instincts instantly kicked in. He knew what this meant: someone from his past had found him. Director Thunder's energy form burst into the hall, their usually calm patterns chaotic with concern. "Mr. Stone, we've received a transmission. They're demanding we hand you over." "Something about a breach of contract?" "Black Sun Corporation," Jack said grimly. "My last employers. They don't like their assets retiring without permission." The hall erupted in worried chatter as security protocols engaged. Force fields hummed to life around the building. They can't just attack an academic institution. Blue's scales had turned pale with shock. The Galactic Council would never allow it. "Corporations don't always wait for permission," Jack explained, already formulating a plan. "Director, how long until they're in range?" 20 minutes. "Our shields will hold for a while, but we're not a military installation." Jack looked around at the faces of his students, human and alien alike. They weren't soldiers, but they weren't helpless either. "Everyone, remember what we learned about working together across species? Time to put it into practice." The next 15 minutes were a blur of activity. Under Jack's guidance, students and faculty used their various natural abilities to strengthen the Academy's defenses. Silicon World students reinforced weak points in the shield grid with their crystalline bodies. Rigelians set up defensive positions with their neural stinger capabilities. Centaurians used their color-shifting abilities to create confusion for any potential invaders. "The ship's launching boarding pods," someone shouted. Jack stood at the command center they'd hastily assembled, surrounded by his former enemies turned allies. "Blue, coordinate with the Rigelian students. Those neural stingers can overload their combat suits if targeted correctly. Gleam, your people's crystalline interference can disrupt their targeting systems." The first wave of corporate mercenaries breached the outer shields, expecting to find a soft academic target. Instead, they met a coordinated defense that used the unique abilities of every species in perfect harmony. Rigelian students disabled power armor with precisely aimed quills. Centaurians created disorienting color patterns that confused targeting systems. Silicon World students formed living barriers that corporate weapons couldn't penetrate. Even the plantoid professors contributed, using their control over vegetative growth to entangle and redirect invaders. In the midst of the chaos, Jack faced down the corporate commander, an old colleague named Rex, whose scarred face showed recognition. "Stone," Rex growled through his combat suit speakers. "You're violating your lifetime contract. Black Sun owns you." "Not anymore," Jack replied, standing his ground. "I found something better than corporate wars. I found a way to make a difference." Rex raised his weapon, but before he could fire, he was hit simultaneously by a Rigelian neural stinger, a Centaurian light burst, and a Silicon World resonance pulse, techniques Jack had taught his students to use in concert. As the corporate forces retreated in disarray, their carefully planned raid ruined by unexpectedly sophisticated resistance, Director Thunder made an announcement: Galactic Council peacekeepers are entering the system. The Black Sun ship is withdrawing. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Academy had ever seen. Species that had once kept to their own kinds now mingled freely, bound together by their shared victory. "You know what this means, don't you?" Blue said to Jack later, his scales showing the pattern for pride. "They'll never see us, any of us, as just students again." Jack looked around at the aftermath. The Academy stood strong, its halls now bearing the marks of battle but also of unity. Students who had once feared or mocked each other were now treating injuries, sharing resources, and working together to repair damage. Director Thunder called an assembly the next day. Their energy form was bright and stable as they addressed the gathered crowd. "Yesterday's events have proven something remarkable," they announced. "This academy isn't just a place of theoretical learning, it's where real change happens. Mr. Stone didn't just teach us about interspecies cooperation, he showed us how it saves lives." The director's form pulsed with formal patterns. "The board has unanimously voted to establish a new department, Practical Interspecies Relations and Defense. Mr. Stone will serve as its head instructor, with students from today's defense as his first teaching assistants." Cheers erupted from the assembled beings. Blue's scales flickered with joy patterns, while Gleam's crystalline form resonated with happiness frequencies. "But sir," Jack stepped forward, "what about Black Sun? They won't stop coming." "Let them try," Director Thunder replied. "The Galactic Council was most impressed by our students' defense of academic freedom. We now have their official protection. And more importantly, we have each other." As Jack looked out at the faces of his students, former bullies turned allies, former enemies turned friends, he realized he'd found something he never had in the corporate wars, a true cause, a real purpose. "One more thing," the director added. "The Academy's non-discrimination policy has been updated. It now actively encourages human applicants, particularly those seeking to leave military service for academic pursuits. It seems we have something to learn from our primitive friends after all." The laughter that filled the hall wasn't mocking this time, it was warm, inclusive, shared across species that had learned to see beyond their differences. That evening, Jack stood in his favorite spot, watching the alien sunset. Blue joined him, along with several other students. "You know," Blue said, his scales showing the pattern for wisdom gained, "when I first saw you, I thought humans were the primitive ones. Now I realize, sometimes the youngest species have the most to teach." Jack smiled. "And sometimes the best teachers are the ones who start as students." Together, they watched the purple sky darken, each lost in thoughts of how far they'd come, and how far they could still go, not as separate species, but as one united academy.